What drew you to this story? What made you want to make a documentary about John Chau, his life, his early years, his mission work, and then ultimately his really tragic death?
Yeah, well, I think first, I will say that I didn't grow up in the church, and I did make a film about 10 years ago about a pastor and his family, actually, and his act of radical faith. And that was the beginning for me of really a conversation. Actually, Amanda and I made the film together. It's called The Overnighters. And I think that growing up in the secular world, I just have a lot of questions about how faith is lived in our country and our culture and its effect on people's lives and our politics. And I want to understand the world I don't understand. That's what motivates, I think, all of our projects. And this one is no different. And I can say that I loved making that film about this pastor. It really opened my heart in meaningful ways. And but it wasn't the end of a conversation. And when we read about John's death, another act of radical faith, I think that we were left with more questions than answers, like what propelled him to this faraway place, to bring the gospel to this uncontacted tribe, and who is this tribe that we've heard almost nothing about, and how have they escaped the world's attention? And that was kind of remarkable and its own mystery. And so there were a lot of news stories about John Chau and his tragic death, but they were very reductive. And I think that we felt if we could take the time and we had the support, which we ended up getting from National Geographic, that we could take on this really challenging and sometimes uncomfortable story. And that's what we've tried to do.
This story, I'll just add one little tiny thing. This story also was one of those rare stories that I think captivated both faith communities and secular communities, and fostered conversation and sometimes pretty rigorous debate within those communities, and sometimes also was the space for conversation between communities of faith and secular people like me. And I think that's a space that we're really happy to be in, and still am. So I think that there's so few stories that do that and are as complicated as this one is.
Yeah, I thought the documentary was really nuanced. It raised some really interesting questions about how we do mission work in the evangelical church. What kind of response have you heard from missionaries, from pastors, from the evangelical community after screening this? Because, of course, fulfilling the Great Commission is the cornerstone of our faith.
Yeah, I think we're just beginning to engage audiences across the board with the film in theaters. It's in theaters now. It will be on Disney Plus, National Geographic streaming in December. So we're really at the beginning of that project. And I can say that it's been invigorating because people have come with strong feelings. They've been challenged by the film. If you think John is a martyr and you come from that background, I think you're going to find an aspect of the story that does challenge you. And I think if you're ready to condemn John, to see him as a kind of an other person who is foolish and you can't relate to, I think you're going to discover more of yourself and ourselves in the stories that he took in, and the power of those stories, and motivating our lives, and also defining how we look at other cultures. And so I think there's a challenging aspect to the film, but I think that I'm excited that the film is bringing people together in spaces to take the film in and to have that conversation. And I think, there's a lot of questioning on both sides. And I think that the film creates a space that respects those points of view. And we tried hard to try to understand and be compassionate to John and the world that he comes from. And that meant building the trust of people who grew up with him, who taught him at ORU, and the organizations that supported him. I think gaining that trust helped us to present him as a dimensional person, not as a construct or a headline. And at the same time, to bring in voices that are also challenging John's worldview and choices, but in a respectful and compassionate way as well.
Definitely. Well, and you guys had access to John's diaries and his social media posts. How did these materials really provide insight into his character and mind that maybe we didn't see in the, hundreds of media reports?
The diary that John left behind was made public by his family, I think, as a way to counter the narrative that was being presented in the memes and in the some of the global news stories, that this was a dimensional human being, as Jesse mentioned, and who had thought through very carefully. In fact, over 10 years, he thought through preparing himself physically, spiritually for this moment. He'd read, I think, like 100 books in the year before actually going there, both religious books, books of past missionaries, but also cultural anthropology books, to try and be careful in his to do as much as he could to prepare for knowing that he's bringing Western what he is bringing of his Western self to this place. And I think that that thoughtfulness was something that was for sure available in these diaries. This was someone who did not want to die. Right? This is someone who loved life. And so that helped me understand a certain part of him. Social media, there's a lot of it. It's not, as you know, that revealing of people's inner lives, right? It's a little bit surface, but that was really interesting to see how he presented himself publicly over the many years. And he was an avid outdoorsman. That's really interesting, and as a point of contact for me. He was young and very social and had many friends who loved him. That was an interesting point that I didn't get from the news stories. What else, Jesse? There was a lot.
I mean, I think there was a paradox to John too, and that he really did love life, and you see that in his Instagram post. He loved to climb mountains and had friends and made friends easily, and was a really open-hearted person. But there was also a hidden side to John, and I think the film is trying to kind of understand that. And I think the most illuminating perspective on the hidden John is his father's letter. For us as parents, connecting with his father Patrick's anguish and theological questioning unlocked the story for us. We were challenged by John. He's not with us anymore to tell his story, but Patrick's letter really grounds the film and is an entry point for a lot of us. Patrick is a Christian too, but had questions about John's choices and perhaps his susceptibility to the influence of people around him to undertake something that perhaps was too risky. I mean, that's up for debate. For someone who loved life to embrace the risk of death, I think that's the paradox of John. Someone who has almost no doubt, seemingly, it seems almost inhuman to most of us, but John seems so unwavering in his faith. And how do you derive such a kind of a strong faith that doesn't leave room for questioning? I think his pastor's perspective, his young pastor, Cameron Silsby, was really valuable. It's one of the few times we understand that John was wrestling with this question of whether this is what God had truly called him to do. So those were all valuable perspectives.
So how did you handle the contrasting viewpoints? Because you do interview a lot of his friends, his associates, his teachers who admired him, but some of them really did question his choices. How did you handle these contrasting viewpoints, and what do they really reveal about the complexity of John's mission?
Every film we make is you set out with questions, and you sure hope people surprise you and you learn stuff. And I think for us, it's such a project of listening. And I think anybody who participates in a film really feels like you just have to create a safe space where they're telling their story, and hope you're there to receive it. So this project was no different, and I think it was really essential to have people who are people of faith and have questioning voices, or agreeing voices, and not just from the outside in. And I think part of any debate about missionary work for me as an outsider is going to be a question of consent. And so I felt that was important to have that voice in there as well, but more the voices of people whose lives paralleled John's, whether it's because they went to that same island, either as a historian or an anthropologist, or they'd walk the walk as a missionary in the way to the degree that John did.
Yeah.
As much as possible, obviously. So Dan Everett's one of those people. I mean, he went and lived in the jungles of the Amazon for 30 years. And so he really had a compassion for John that um, I, so he could relate to John and I could relate to Dan. And I think that point of connection was so critical for me in understanding John, and whose life is so different than my own. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I'm so interested as filmmakers, after, did your perspective on this entire story change from starting the film to the end? Or how did your own personal emotional journey, how was it impacted by this?
I think one thing that was really surprising was we saw ourselves in some of John's choices and the stories that he took in ways we didn't expect to, and discovering that the secular stories that we share, the Tintin, the Robinson Crusoe, the movies of boys who survive in the wilderness, these are stories that we grew up on in National Geographic magazine, which John took in. Of course, we had in my house as a kid. It really defined how we think about the world beyond our borders and indigenous cultures in particular. And I think that we're in a cultural reckoning moment now, and thinking about how we have otherized and defined both indigenous communities in our own country and our history and relationship with them, but also in the wider world. And so I think seeing suddenly our own history and being in a position to look at National Geographic, even though we're making a film with National Geographic, they gave us permission to do that because we said, you've had a role in this story. The magazine published a feature about this tribe in which you defined them in a certain way. And let's look at that. And those stereotypes, or those conventions, call them, that have defined how we look at tribes in the 20th century have really had a kind of pernicious effect, and not just on missionaries like John Chau, I think you could argue, but on all of us. And I think that was a surprise that we didn't know was awaiting us when we embarked on the story. And I think we'll reflect on everybody who comes to this film, that the way in which this film is not just about John, it's a story about the stories we take in and the power of those stories.
I really liked how you guys incorporated animation into the film. So can you talk about that decision to use animated sequences to depict his trip to the North Sentinel Island and other, unrecorded aspects of his story? So what artistic choices were made during these sequences, and what do you feel like they were going to really add to the documentary?
Great question. We've never worked with animation before as a tool or a part of our palette. We're usually making Cine Verite films, so we're following a present tense story as it's unfolding. This was the point of contact when what is written in the diary is really covering this period of time during the 2 weeks he was quarantining before going to the island, and then the 3 attempts that he makes, that John made to get to the island. There was no imagery for that, and we were not ourselves going to go to this island to film. So many times documentaries will use reenactment. So it's, but that was not going to be something we felt comfortable doing here, because it's just we were not going to hire people to play a tribe that no one knows anything about or has talked to. I also think that sometimes documentaries get into a tricky place with people who watch them when they see something that looks real and they think, well, that's what really happened. That's actual footage that was captured. And so what's beautiful about animation is that there's no confusion that this is a representation, this is a projection, this is a subjective understanding of what this contact may have looked like based on our reading of his diary and based on historical knowledge of whatever few photographs have been taken or video that's been captured of the Sentinelese. So it's a very hard medium to create and very slow, and in that way I think has a beauty to it, because there's so many decisions that are made. How colorful, how much, how people are drawn, how how wide is the, you know, it's a little more like fiction in the way that it's created, because you really storyboard every moment. So it is without a doubt Amanda and Jesse and the artists that we work with to make the animations presentation of this moment of contact.
You could argue, I mean, depending on where you come from when you come to this story, that John died for, any number of reasons, that he was naive, that he truly died for, for his faith, I think there's an interpretation that John was enchanted by story to a degree that he lost perspective on the true inherent risk of what he was undertaking, and perhaps the worthiness, and that he had been shaped by stories of heroic young men who set out to prove themselves and managed to survive. And I think that kind of naivete, or enchantment, I would call it, is part of what motivated the desire to work in that form. I think it mirrors in some ways how we perceive John's formation as a young person. And so psychologically, I think it served to underscore the imagination and ultimately the consequence of having a romantic conception of your role as a hero in the story of your own construction. That you ultimately do not control your fate. And in the stories, the hero survives. And so I think that was on a deeper level part of what informed our thinking about that form.
That's so interesting. That really did strike me, and how that kind of starkly contrasts End of the Spear, right? Where you're getting a very clear visual of what happened. And I really thought that was an interesting and really intelligent artistic choice on your end to use animation.
I think that the richness of the story was to discover not just that animation was a form to tell this part of the story, but there were these incredible films like End of the Spear, or documentaries like the documentation of the Nate Saint, Jim Elliott, that story. The way missionaries are great documentarians, and so we really were the beneficiary of some of that incredible documentary storytelling. And the palette of this movie really opened out, and surprising ways. Even the movie King Kong, we discovered, was inspired by a trip to the Andaman Islands, and I think that kind of collage was not only creatively exciting, but also represented what sort of the narrative that John pieced together for himself about his place in the world.
So after viewers watch this film, what kind of questions do you hope they'll be talking about regarding the complexity of mission work, right? What kind of conversations do you hope this documentary will raise?
I hope it raises questions, maybe more than it gives you answers. I do feel like our point of view is in the end of the film. I don't think people should go to that island. It's illegal. It's a problem for a number of reasons. But I do think that the most of the film has enough in it that my hope is whatever you come to this project with, afterwards you have a conversation, and you might be talking with someone who has the same background as you might be talking to someone who's very different, but my hope is that it does foster conversation. These are really difficult questions, and that tends to be where Jesse and I are happiest, is like, what are the conversations that make you the most uncomfortable? And so I don't know if there's a lot of answers. I do think that when I watch this film, every time I'm left with a takeaway of understanding that as we get older and understand that that the hero's journey, you're not really the center of the narrative. Actually, as you get older, you understand it's a very big picture, and you're part of it. But what happens when you decentralize yourself from the narrative? And I'm not sure that John ever got to that place with understanding, but he did. But I will never know. That's Amanda's view on things. Jesse, do you have any other takeaways?
I mean, I hope for people who come with your background or John's background to wrestle with the question of where the line is between good missionary work and, if you define what John did as reckless or bad, what irresponsible missionary work can look like. And I can't tell you where that line is, of course, or how to live your faith if you have those beliefs. And but I hope that the film creates a space for people who are convinced of the righteousness of John's actions to think about this a little bit differently. And if you come thinking that you can condemn John, you might see that you have stories that you have taken in that probably deserve some scrutiny and require you to draw some lines that maybe are differently drawn than you anticipated. So yeah, that's my hope.